Hello and welcome back to the William Gomes podcast. I am William Gomes and I'm grateful to have you here. This series is called Reading Seminar 1 and 2, Lacan's Return to Freud Revisited. In the previous episode, we established a decisive distinction. The ego is not the subject. We saw why Jacques Lacan insists that the ego is an effect of identification and misrecognition, while the subject of psychoanalysis is divided, dissented, and constituted through speech. In this episode, we examine the register in which the ego is formed and sustained. This brings us to two closely linked concepts: narcissism and the imaginary dimension. These terms are often misunderstood both inside and outside psychoanalysis. Lacan's contribution is to clarify their structure and their limits. Let us begin with narcissism. In everyday usage, narcissism is usually understood as excessive self-love, vanity, or self-absorption. From this perspective, narcissism appears as a moral or personality flaw. Lacan rejects this understanding. For Lacan, narcissism is not a matter of loving oneself too much. It is a structural relation to an image. Narcissism refers to the way the subject comes to identify with an image of themselves as whole, coherent, and unified. This image provides stability. It allows the subject to say, "This is me." But this identification is not discovered from within. It is mediated from outside. The ego is formed through identification with images that appear complete and coherent. These images can be literal, as in early visual identifications, or symbolic and social, as in ideals, roles, and expectations. What matters is not the content of the image, but its function. The image offers the subject a sense of unity that compensates for the internal division. This is why narcissism is not optional. It is necessary. Without narcissistic identification, the subject would lack any stable sense of self. Psychic life would be unmanageable. But this necessity comes at a cost. The ego's unity is achieved through misrecognition. The subject identifies with an image that does not correspond to the lived division. The ego, therefore, covers over conflict rather than resolving it. This brings us to the imaginary dimension. Lacan introduces the imaginary to name a register of psychic life organized around images, forms, and identifications. It is the register of resemblance, rivalry, and comparison. In the imaginary, relations are structured by mirror-like dynamics. The subject recognizes themselves in an image, but this recognition is always accompanied by misrecognition. The image promises wholeness, but it also introduces competition. If I identify with an image of completeness, then others who appear complete become rivals. This is why Lacan insists that the imaginary is inseparable from aggression. Aggression does not arise because people are inherently hostile. It arises because identification with an image of wholeness creates tension with others who seem to occupy the same place. Narcissism, rivalry, and aggression are therefore structurally linked. This insight has important clinical consequences. The imaginary is powerful. It organizes how subjects see themselves and others. It structures emotions such as envy, jealousy, admiration, and humiliation. But precisely because it is powerful, it is theoretically misleading if taken as the foundation of psychoanalysis. When analysis operates primarily at the imaginary level, it becomes preoccupied with self-image, self-esteem, and relational dynamics. The analyst and analyze, and can become caught in mirror relations, responding to one another as rival egos. This is why Lacan warns against treating the analytic relationship as an encounter between two selves. If analysis becomes a struggle between egos, it loses access to the unconscious. The imaginary is not false, but it is insufficient. It explains how the ego functions, but not how the subject is structured. This is why Lacan insists that the ego belongs to the imaginary register. The ego is an imaginary construction. It is sustained through images, identifications, and narratives that provide coherence. But the subject of the unconscious does not belong to the imaginary. It emerges through speech, repetition, and disruption. It is not visible as an image. This distinction allows us to understand why ego psychology, which treats the ego as the center of psychic life, remains confined to the imaginary. By contrast, psychoanalysis must operate beyond the imaginary, even though it cannot bypass it entirely. This does not mean that analysis ignores narcissism or self image. On the contrary, these phenomena are clinically significant, but they must be approached structurally rather than therapeutically. For example, attempts to improve self esteem may stabilize the ego, but they also reinforce imaginary identification. They strengthen the very structure that resists unconscious work. Similarly, when the analyst responds to the analyzed and's demands for recognition, validation, or reassurance, they risk reinforcing imaginary relations. This does not mean the analyst must be cold or dismissive. It means they must avoid occupying the position of the ideal image. The analyst's ethical position, as we saw in earlier episodes, involves refusing to confirm the ego's demand for wholeness. This refusal creates frustration, but it also creates space. In that space, speech can move beyond imaginary rivalry and begin to encounter something of the subject's structure. Understanding narcissism and the imaginary dimension, therefore, prepares us for the next step in Lacan's teaching. If the imaginary organizes ego and identification, then psychoanalysis must rely on another register to explain how the subject is constituted. In the next episode, we will turn to language, speech, and discourse. We will examine why Lacan insists that psychoanalysis is grounded not in images or relationships, but in the structure of language itself. Thank you for listening. This is the William Gomes podcast. Take care of yourself, stay curious, and if you found this episode helpful, you're very welcome to follow, share, leave a comment, or a rating. I'll speak with you again soon.